Hi, this is Sophie Wade, and I'm delighted to be here with you again, having some innovative conversations about what's going on in the workplace. And it has been very challenging over the summer, really trying to get into the fall and get our rhythms again, and trying to understand how we can really connect as we're getting into a different cadence working wherever we are, whether some people are back in the office, some people are working from home, and trying to work out how we can really collaborate. And that means not just, collaborate about good things, but also be able to connect when we're having more difficult conversations, when we're trying to get through a sort of hiccup in a project, or dealing with challenging things at home, or, whatever it might be. Some of these conversations aren't that easy. And it's even harder to have those when you're not necessarily in the same place and you can't go and sit quietly and really sort of check into that conversation and focus and connect personally, one-on-one. So I have somebody with me today I've known him for several years now. We've had a lot in common thinking about the future of work, which has arrived, how companies, how teams can all set themselves up to collaborate effectively together. He has now just co-authored a book, which is really dealing with some of those very challenging ways of communicating, how we can get through them, how we can prepare for them. So Bob Gower, I am so thrilled to be talking with you today. And please, how are you?
I'm so good. I think we're living here in New York City as well. I know you spent some time here. I don't know if you're here now or not, but it's a beautiful rainy fall day in New York, and it doesn't at all feel like the world is insane at the moment. But even though the news tells me it is, so
right, it is very challenging. So, love to just dive right in, but I always go back to the beginning, first of all. And considering we've had quite similar trajectories in terms of the things that we've been talking about and how we really focus on some of the core challenges that teams are dealing with, where they're working to do with technology, how did you come up with how do you get towards thinking about these difficult conversations that you've been writing about in your book, Radical Alignment?
Wow, I don't know how far back you want me to go in my path. It's been a rather weird and circuitous one, but
whatever's relevant when we're talking about radical alignment. But
yeah. Well, what's interesting is I think, and I've been returning to these roots recently, is what I really care about, and what I've always sort of cared about is, I know it sounds kind of weird or cliche, but I want to make the world a better place. I would like to feel like I contributed to a better world through my work. And that led me into, I have an MBA that's focused on sustainability, which is looking at the sort of the financial and social as well as environmental performance of companies, sort of the triple bottom line, they call it. And as I was doing that work, I became really fascinated by the connection between how an organization is structured and how people behave inside the organization, and then the output of that organization. And we see this in the technology world. I always go back to something very weird and old called Conway's Law, which sort of states that the structure of a technology team really matters in terms of what it creates. Like the communication connections inside that technology team, you can actually see replicated in the code that they write, in the way the code kind of communicates with each other. But I see this writ really large, that the way people interact, especially in boardrooms or in leadership team rooms and conference rooms, really matters in terms of what that organization is able to accomplish in the world, both in terms of the innovations and the profits it's able to make, and also in, let's call it, its kind of moral impact, its impact on society and its impact on the environment. So I became very, very interested in how those teams can operate better. And what I found is, one of the biggest issues is I think teams kind of avoid difficult conversations, or they have them poorly when they do. They wait until it's too late, until the thing is too big and too hard to wrap their arms around. They don't lean into, to borrow a phrase from Sheryl Sandberg, right? They don't lean into the difficult conversation sort of early enough, or maybe with enough skill or enough openness to really have it in a constructive way.
And is that hampered by the technology? Is the technology interfering, or somehow, are there multiple? It seems that from what you're saying, that there are different ways that the technology is creating a barrier, or different types of barriers to having that conversation.
Yeah, I don't know if the technology, technology is sort of, it's not neutral, right? Technology has an opinion. I was just debating with some fellow consultants today. We were talking about Teams versus Zoom. Doing video. We're all like on these video calls all the time now, and so we're starting to compare the technology. And one sort of simple thing is that Teams, your video, the people are down in the bottom. Whereas in Zoom, you can kind of move people around and move people up in the top. So I can make it look like I'm looking somebody in the eye because I can look at my camera more easily in Zoom than I can in Teams. That's just kind of one very small and very sort of narrow difference between two really similar technologies. But then you even get into like, okay, if I'm going to communicate somebody, am I going to write them an email, or am I going to be in a threaded conversation in Slack? Am I going to give somebody a phone call while I go for a walk, or am I going to do a video while I, put on a pretend suit, here in quarantine land? So I wouldn't say necessarily the technology. I think it can help and it can hinder. The point is, and the point I make with most of my clients is that we need to choose your technology stack deliberately, carefully, and we need to experiment over time and really look at what kind of interaction is it creating and what kind of interaction do we want to create. The work that I do sort of fits under the umbrella of culture, and culture is such a strange and nuanced. It's a hard like concept to wrap your arms around, but I really think of it as how the place feels, like my emotional interaction with the team I'm working on or with the organization, and then that is really mitigated by often the technology that I'm kind of interacting and using to interact with people.
It's so interesting what you say about the challenge of not looking at the person, or not appearing to, because right now I don't feel that I'm looking at you because I'm looking right at the camera. But if I look at you, or I look at what I can see as you, and I think it must be that there will be sort of implications of us getting used to talking for long periods of time, not to you, not looking you in the eyes, although you are. So how do you get over that? How do you at least, for that one piece of it, set people up to be able to make the best connection when technology can be creating some barriers, or the appearance of some barriers? What's in this technology stack that you recommend that can at least get that piece of it out of the way?
Yeah, I mean, the technology stack I recommend is pretty straightforward. I like Zoom for video calls. I like Slack for threaded conversations. I detest email when it comes to internal teams. I don't really think, we should have email inside of companies, because it promotes kind of secrecy and siloed conversations. And not only that, but it overwhelms people. And then some kind of multi-tenant software like Google, for if you're creating a document or something you can all be in together, those are sort of the, you have to track the work, you have to do the work, and you have to talk about the work. And then, so for tracking the work, I recommend things like Trello or Asana or, Monday or whatever. I think each one has its own opinion or its own way of looking at the world. And the idea is just to find one that matches up with you. And I think also experimenting over time. What's so interesting to me about this time, and I was working with a leadership team, kind of in a fairly intensive strategy, delivery that we were doing right when the pandemic hit. And what I found was, so we actually ended up having to pivot and sort of help them, suddenly become this in-person company, suddenly become all remote. And what we found was that because we were suddenly becoming remote, it gave us the opportunity to work on things that we've been wanting to work on all along. In other words, we wanted to work on like how people made decisions, how often they interacted, what their meeting structures looked like. So we went from the leadership team I was working with, when I first started working with them, they only talked to each other when there was a big problem. And when the pandemic hit, they suddenly met every single morning for at least a half an hour at 8 a.m. And I was facilitating most of those conversations. And they moved from being a team that was a little bit disconnected from each other. They generally liked each other and they generally agreed, but one that sort of had a lot of disconnects and had a lot of difficulty, to one that became really tightly coupled and tightly aligned. And what that really taught me is that good team practices, I think, transcend technology, right? That you need to use the technology that serves the practices or serves the kind of team culture that you're trying to create, not the other way around, right?
Right, and it's very interesting that they, or not that they would have they obviously didn't realize, but if they're only talking to each other when there's a problem, I mean, therefore, psychologically, when I see your face, I'm like, oh my goodness, there's an issue. What do we have to deal with now? Rather than having the positive kind of like, let's have a conversation. Let's see what we have to deal with today, good and bad. So those are some of the very, I think there are probably many more basic elements to it. And obviously, I'm the big empathy person. So it really is also about, trying to read those interactions and see where people are and really connect with them to begin with. But when we were talking before, it was also not just, the technology stack that's sort of relevant and going to be appropriate depending on what that particular team is dealing with, but also the preparation when you're going into that conversation. How did you, particularly with this company, when you were seeing the type of conversations, how did you help them prepare? How did you sort of turn the different, just the practical operating types of conversations they were having? That's it's a very basic point, but it goes to, cultural issues, relationship issues. How did you deal with that?
Yeah. So, I mean, as you know, I'm also a big fan of empathy and the word empathy. I haven't done a word count in my book, but I think it probably appears more than, other, almost any other word in the book that's not not the or an article or something, right?
Yeah.
So, and I always think, radical alignment in many ways is a prescription. It's like a linear process that my co-author, who happens to be my wife, and I created that was really a way of developing empathy. And we often quote Chris Voss, who I'm sure you know of, and I'm sure many of your listeners will as well. He's the FBI hostage negotiator who talks about the importance of what he calls tactical empathy. Right? I need to understand another person's world. I don't need to approve of that world necessarily, because sometimes we conflate those two things. We think empathy means I like everything you do. And that it doesn't need to mean that, right? It can mean like, I don't approve of what you do, but I understand your world. I can kind of see the world through your eyes and through your glasses. And so what we do is we sort of think of things, and I think of things in sort of a few different stacks. So on the one hand, we just need to get people talking a little bit more with each other. And our conversation, we have a structured conversation that we describe in Radical Alignment. And the idea is to fill up some informational buckets that tend to go unfilled about other people. And then when we don't have that information, we aren't able to contextualize their behavior or predict their behavior, which often leads to us being surprised or being disappointed or feeling betrayed. And those buckets are essentially, right, that we don't understand somebody's values. We don't understand like sort of why they're doing what they're doing. People can take a job for money. They can take a job for love. They can take a job for love of learning. They can take a job for the love of the team, but just really kind of understanding what somebody's values are. Likewise, we want to understand what sort of triggers fear in somebody else. And that can be highly personal. It can be really irrational at times. I mean, we're humans. We're just so irrational. I mean, like, everybody has irrational fears. And sometimes it's fun to know like what those irrational fears are. When my wife and I wrote the book together, we had the conversation, and we both realized that we were afraid that by taking on a work project together, which we had never done in like 8 years of relationship, right, that we would end up divorced. And then then also we'd end up not only divorced, but dying alone under a bridge somewhere, like it just sort of like, that's where the brain goes. And so when we shared those fears with each other, we were like, oh, we had to laugh about it, but we also allowed us to create a rule or generate, like a protocol with each other that, look, our relationship is more important than the project. And that if it does start to really stress this out, that unilaterally, either one of us could say, I'm out. And the other person would be okay with that. But also if one person stepped out, the other person could continue the project by themselves if they wanted to. So it was sort of like a prenuptial agreement in a way, right? It was sort of like, we like each other now, but here's what we're going to do when we don't like each other. So, and here's how we're going to deal with it.
And how was that conversation?
That conversation actually went really well. I mean, and it was almost, how do you say, like so obvious because you know, when you have so much history with somebody, and you know, my wife and I like to say we've both been through bad marriages in the past. We are a little bit older. We got married a little bit later in life,
right?
And so we know how good we have it. You know, like we're like we got this good. This is a good relationship. And this is more important than anything else. And that kind of even goes back to the first point, which is values. Like we value the relationship over the work product, and therefore we can generate this rule or this protocol that's going to keep us from getting into trouble down the road. And if we didn't have that conversation early on, we might have gotten into trouble down the road. And that sort of brings me to kind of the I'm just going to do the last two buckets really fast, and then we can kind of talk about them. But the next bucket is what are kind of the what keeps us safe? What helps us perform well? What do we need really is the bucket. Like because some people need a lot of sleep. Some people need a little sleep. Some people work better in the morning. Some people work better in the afternoon. Some people, are more visual and need to learn things visually. Some people are more auditory. And it's just sort of like, and these are really, really personal things. I personally need to exercise every day or I'm impossible to live with, right? And so it's just sort of we call these boundary conversations. And the boundary we created we created the boundary of, one of us can take the project and the other person can leave, right? So that was a kind of shared boundary, but we also have our individual boundaries. And then the final bucket that really gets us in trouble, I think, is that we don't understand each other's visions for the future. So it's a little bit different from the first bucket, which is, kind of our values. Like I might value money, but I might value money because I have a vision for the future, because my vision for the future is that I actually want to make enough money to go, like a good friend of mine, he wants to make enough money to take his family to Greece and set up a permaculture farm and just live there for the rest of his life. Like that's what he's really focused on money in a way because that's what he wants to do. And so understanding what people's vision of the future is, we call this the dreams section of the book, but really kind of like getting involved in like, hey, if this is going to be great, what's that going to mean for you? What's that going to create for you? And we find that these four buckets, really kind of help us develop empathy and understand somebody else's position.
It's so interesting. And I would love, as part of that, to return to the just sort of dig in a little bit to this whole idea of boundaries. I think, we have a different technology has both reduced boundaries. And then, of course, now so many people are working from home. We have more physical boundaries, but we don't have boundaries between sort of the beginning of the day and the end of the day. But it also means, we're also entering people's homes, and we're seeing much more. And I've commented as well, and I'll comment again. I love the rainbow, the rainbow coloring of all the books on your shelves, because it tells me something about you and possibly how bored you were during lockdown. But also. So the boundaries have changed, and how does that have the conversation? Obviously, it's different when you're having a conversation with your wife, and book or co-author. How does that change the boundaries in terms of these difficult conversations that people need to have at work, and how they approach them, and how that they can overcome them, but also be very respectful of where someone is and the things that they're dealing with, as they enter into, that challenging discussion? Yeah,
such a good question. A couple of things. One is I find that boundaries, I know you have kids, I have kids, and any parent will tell you that boundaries are really important, but they better be flexible and negotiable or else they're going to really get you into trouble. So, and I think that's true in all of life, right? That actually boundary conversations, should be kind of almost a path of discovery and they're ongoing, because the question at the heart of the boundary conversation is what helps you be your best? What helps you be your best version of yourself, what helps you do the best work you can do, but also kind of, what helps you live the best life that you can. And I think what's really interesting to me when I have this conversation with leaders at organizations is how rarely we ask this question in a work context. How rarely do I, it's so rare that I ask somebody, or that I was asked, like I was in business for a long time. I was a newspaper designer, a website designer, a product manager in Silicon Valley. And I did a lot of different careers before I did what I do now. Excuse me. And during that time, I don't recall many bosses saying, I really care about your quality of life and tell me what you need to do your best work. How would you do your best? I mean, it's sort of like a question that wouldn't even have made sense, back in the 90s. Like, what? You're asking me about boundaries. But when you think about what we need from our teams, is we need their best work, right? That's what we want. If I'm a team leader, I want people to be doing their best work. I want, this idea of engagement. I want people to be engaged. I want people to feel like they're personally invested in the work that we're doing together. And so, of course, I should be asking them and helping them craft the work day that works for them, and the style of work, the style of communication. It's a wonderful methodology I found a little while ago. I think I learned about it from Brad Feld, the investor, from his blog, and it's called User Manual to Me. And it's where you sort of like write out, like, this is how I like to be communicated with. This is how I like to be corrected. This is when I need to sleep.
I love that.
Right? Just let people know.
It was something that came up for me several years ago in terms of this sort of my own user operating manual. The challenge with that, and this is me, leaning in to agree with you, is it also requires us to be very self-aware. Now, I think one of the things about COVID and working from home, it really has elevated our awareness about how we do like to work or don't like to work. Some people hate working from home, or they found a place that does work for them or a time of the day. So I think we do have more awareness. But you're creating that user operating manual. It's not a small thing. I mean, that's to really try and understand and work it out. I mean, it's a process. How do you encourage people to be able to find out what to put in that user operating manual that they can then share it?
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm actually working with a client now, and what we've decided, I've kind of been dancing around this conversation because I fear that he's close to burnout. He's got a very stressful job in finance. He's a remarkable professional, and what we're really, and he also has a young child at home, and him actually, the pandemic has been kind of interesting in that he's gotten to spend more time with his family, and he's just found how much that feeds him and how important that was to him, where he was always the guy who was like going to the office at 7:30 and coming home at 10 p.m. That he lived that kind of New York City lifestyle. And now what we're really going back to is values, right? Like, and I think values really, what is important to you in life? What kind of human being do you want to be? What kind of life do you want to lead? And then let's craft, your schedule, maybe create some protocols for you. For him, I think, a little bit more exercise is kind of important. And, for us, like, we've created a lot around our household. We've been working from home forever. This isn't kind of new to us. We've had, my wife is also a writer and a coach. And so we've had this, kind of home office lifestyle for a very long time. But we do things like once it's about 5 or 6 o'clock, phones go into the credenza, and into the charger, and they don't come out again. And we've recently been watching an episode of The Office almost every evening. It's sort of our state change, between like busy day to nighttime. We've also learned to give each other a lot of space. So we both have a morning journaling practice. So we wake up early before our high school age son, and we'll both sort of sit quietly and not even talk to each other, because we just know that we're in this own, we want our own sort of, giving each other personal space, which when you live in we have a nice apartment in New York City, but it's still the size of a New York City apartment. So there's not much space to get away from each other. So really creating these little protocols. And I think, again, One, it's going back to values. It's being really clear about what's important to you, and that can require a bit of courage, because sometimes what's important to us feels potentially like it's going to upset somebody else or cost us money or something like that. So sometimes you have to sort of lean into that a little bit. And then, also just being experimental, just, hey, let's try this for a little while. And for my wife and I and our family, it's staying in constant communication rather than, like, we started this conversation, rather than letting things hit a boiling point and then saying, like, in a very severe tone, we need to talk. When you're really upset, being more like, hey, I'm finding that, like, I need a little more personal space in the morning. What would you think about trying this? And like
Right.
really being able to talk to each other about that.
And how does one, I think that's easier potentially with one's spouse, but how is it harder for, I think, for managers who certainly aren't used to this type of very, much more personal or relationship driven way of dealing with each other. Very, very importantly, because I completely agree with you that this is what we, focusing on how do we help each person do their best work, and each person is an individual, and that's so important. And really sort of trying to work that out and dealing, on a more personal basis. How are you able to help managers lean into those conversations? Because even a difficult conversation may be, to do with conflict, but it also may be to do with just getting much more personal. That may be very difficult for some people.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, we actually recently worked with a group of therapists who work in grief counseling, which was really interesting. And what we found is that, like, some of them really wanted to be more personal with each other, and some were like, no, like, my personal time is mine. Like, I don't want to have, like, I don't want to do the super sensitive check-in question. I just want to kind of do my job, and it became a little bit of a source of tension for them. And I think, again, so there's kind of maybe two sort of processes that I tend to do a lot of. And one would be facilitating the conversation that I described, where we talk about people's values, people's concerns, people's boundaries and needs and their dreams, like just getting a little personal, like that can be super helpful. And it really kind of helps ground the group in each other's context and develop a little bit of empathy for each other. The next step after that is usually to do what we call team chartering. And that's really to take a team and say, okay, we're a team and we're organized around a outcome, or we're organized around a set of goals or an intent. We could be that we're the leadership team of an organization, and our job is essentially to, be responsible to the bottom line of our investors, to be responsible to our investors, to be responsible to our customers, to be responsible to our board and to each other and our, and our employees, and all of the, kind of take care of the business, right? Or it could be a team that is a development team that's building a specific product. It doesn't really matter. Every team kind of should have, we think of it as a mission, right? They, and you can describe it in a variety of ways. But a lot of teams don't take the time to describe that mission, right? They don't, it sort of seems like, oh, we know what it is. We know our mission. But then you ask everybody, okay, you tell me what the mission is. Now you tell me what the mission is. Now you tell me, and you'll get like a different answer from every person. Everybody's like, that's what you think we do. So the team chartering process, it starts with mission definition. Like, let's just be really clear on why we're a team. And then let's talk about the things that we need to do in order to be successful. So let's talk about the roles and accountabilities. Like, what do we each need to do? What kind of skills do we need to be present? Let's talk about the tools. We talked about tools earlier. Like, how are we going to communicate with each other? Where are we going to do work? Where are we going to save files to? Because, I don't know how many teams, I've worked with so many teams where they're like, wait, where's that file? And people are like, I don't know. Like, you end up having to hunt through email. Like, let's just kind of let's avoid all of that by just being clear with each other about, this is our starting set of tools and this is how we're going to use them. I also tend to generate working agreements, which include, we're going to meet on a regular cadence, like we'll meet to plan every couple of weeks. We might meet every month or so to retrospect and reflect on how we're doing as a team. We might meet daily in some cases if things are changing a lot, in order to just sort of keep each other updated. Might be a quick half-hour, 15-minute meeting, kind of from like an agile style stand-up. But let's get clear on all of that. And then I also ask people to kind of capture what I think of as, I've begun to describe this recently as behavioral intent or cultural intent, not behavioral norms, because it's really, when I say behavioral norms, it's really easy to be like, we're going to always be kind to each other. I'm like, yeah, that's nice to say, but are you really going to do that? Like when things get tough, are you really going to be kind? And so rather than have that hard and fast, it's more like, well, let's say we want a psychologically safe culture. We want a culture that's based on trust and empathy, and, or we want a culture that's based on harsh feedback and top performance, or, different people have maybe different thoughts and different needs and different ideas around this kind of thing. But let's be clear that this is the kind of team we intend to be. This is the kind of culture we intend to create. And so I find just sort of chartering really that
articulating it and so everybody at least knows where they stand and what's expected of them and how they're expected to behave.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's not, I was going to say that's half the battle. I think it's like 98% of the battle is really just being clear with each other. And sometimes that requires an awful lot of courage, right? It requires, it can be.
And when we're not in the same place, things that we thought were clear, may not be, right? Because it was just sort of assumed that things would happen in a certain way. And now we actually have to be deliberate or purposeful or very, it has to be very evident what we're doing and why we're doing it. So there's less room for it in misinterpretation. And how do you then approach, if there is a difficult conversation, let's say, somebody has, or it's not clear if there's a wrong direction that's been taken, or it might be a mistake that's happened in the project, and the manager needs to talk to one of the his direct reports about what's gone on. How's the best way to approach that? Imagining the conditions are reasonable. I mean, they're not going to be perfect. We're all a work in progress, right? So how can that manager set him or herself up for success as they sort of approach it, and then have the conversation in the most productive way that both people end up, and the project too, having the most successful outcome?
Yeah. I'm going to go back actually to Chris Voss, the hostage negotiator, with this a little bit too. Yeah, because one of the things we're not that we're negotiating for hostages, hopefully, in our workplace, but one of the things he always says, which I really respond to, is that listening is a martial art. And so he emphasizes that if you're trying to get what you want, that you really need to learn how to listen rather than learn how to speak. That persuasion is actually much more about the questions you ask and the way you listen to the responses to those questions than it is about the, the conditions that you said or how persuasive that you are. I mean, I don't consider myself a very persuasive, argumentative kind of person. But I am really good at, asking questions and being curious and listening, and then letting the solution kind of emerge from the conversation rather than going in with a decided upon course of action. Now, sometimes that might be the case. I mean, sometimes if you've decided to fire somebody, like, get that done quick, right? Don't go in a half-hearted sort of like, I'm just want to ask you some questions, and by the way, you're fired, kind of way, right? Just be like, okay, we need to talk. We've just reached an impasse, and this is the impasse is that we're not going to work together anymore. But one of the things I think we can really do in preparing for those conversations is, and I don't mean to keep plugging my own book, but I wrote it for a reason, that this kind of intentions, concerns, boundaries, and dreams structure is super useful to do before you go into the conversation for yourself, because sometimes we're just not clear on what we're talking about, like, and why we're talking about it. We're clear, like, I mentioned I was a design director at a newspaper. And so sometimes people would make design mistakes, and then I would do really dumb things like call them out in public and be like, you shouldn't do this. And I would think that I had done my job because I'd be like holding up the page that, and I would embarrass them, and I would, make them resent me, and I would really destroy that relationship. And I learned some very, very hard lessons in that role. And I think but had I been more clear with myself, I'd been like, I just, what I want is I want them to actually go back to the style guide that we have. I want them to read it. I want them to be aware that, this is what we do and this is not what we do. And probably calling them in and talking to them and being like, hey, I want to talk to you about the design of the newspaper. So you can help me improve it. And so I can help you improve your work. And so we can mesh and create a really great product together. Right now, I may have some very specific, like, this is a boundary I have, like, you aren't, You do not do, stack headlines, 3 lines. They're only ever 2 lines, or, some kind of stupid newspaper design rule, right? But at the end of the day, I also want them to feel like they have a say, and I want to hear what, I want them to have input. And I think this is what we all really want to. We want to do good work for the most part. I think it's rare that I encounter somebody who doesn't want to do good work when given the opportunity to participate, when they're given the opportunity to speak. And so I try to just encourage people to be specific about what you want to ask about, be specific about what you want to talk about and why. Yeah.
So I'd love to throw a small spanner into the works to make it more challenging, because that listening to the other person obviously needs to be authentic, right? In order to have it matter, that listening needs to be real. And one of the things that I have seen so much of is that, for example, particularly with younger generations, whether they're millennials or Gen Z, they do have other ideas, and maybe they kind of go, but dude, it shouldn't be 2 stack. I mean, 3 stack is a new thing. I mean, didn't you know? And it really could look cool. And there needs to be some open-mindedness, and the newspapers are maybe a very different example, but I'm just saying that creating the openness on the person who is coming to propose that something needs to be done in a different way, but still have that openness to whatever the person is going to say, so that they do feel respected and validated and can really engage in the conversation. How do you help with that piece of it? Because it's not necessarily easy, and that's some of the where I see some of the biggest challenges.
Yeah, and it's a challenge that I have myself. I think I think we teach what we need to learn sometimes, right?
Oh yeah.
So, I can't say much, I guess. I mean, I'm a coach for a reason, right? And part of that is, and when I do coach, I'm not expecting perfection out of people, but we are frequently pushing on what makes them feel uncomfortable. Where do they feel discomfort? And then how are they responding to that discomfort? And, I always think about how ego and power are such a toxic combination, and they're very, very common in business. And I think we can probably assign a usual gender and race to the people that are using that, which happens to be mine and happens to be also my weakness at times. There are times where, when I've been very successful, I'll develop a little bit of an ego about it, and if I have the power to hire and fire somebody, then I'll start to kind of, even unconsciously, unintentionally at times, sort of wield that power in order to keep myself from feeling uncomfortable. And so, I think the real challenge, and I think we have, since I've brought up race and gender, I need to bring up diversity and inclusion, right? And this is something that's very near and dear to my heart. It's something that I think is both a sort of a moral imperative for society, but I also think it's almost a survival or a quality imperative for organizations, right? That you need to actually have a lot of different views, a lot of different kinds of perspectives looking at your product in order to create, real innovation, in order to create real quality. The challenge is that when you invite in, let's call it contrarian views that are often based on background and identity, right? If I'm raised, female, I'll have different life experiences and therefore a different perspective on what I'm working on than if I was raised male. It's just sort of, the world has treated me in a different way. My attention is on different things, and that's really powerful. The problem is that it will often be contrarian to what other people are seeing, which introduces conflict. It actually, and so and I think this is something we don't appreciate enough, that when we are talking about diversity, and I don't mean this in a bad way at all, I hope it doesn't come across like that, we're actually talking about introducing more conflict, or more, let's call it cognitive dissonance, into the organization, because we're actually creating an opportunity for more perspectives to mesh together. And this is why having difficult conversations and being able to hear contrarian views without getting defended, and being curious and staying open, and then letting the solution sort of emerge from that rich, conversation, I believe it's so important. And I believe we're just not set up for it anymore, right? Not anymore. I mean, we're not set up for it historically, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not the way organizations run. You know?
No, and I do think that very interesting and very powerfully, the fact that it is so much about going out of our comfort zones in all kinds of ways, and having that discomfort, being uncomfortable and putting ourselves in a situation that we're making ourselves open to being uncomfortable, whatever it might be, about a new project, but also very much in the terms of diversity and inclusion. And one of the things that I think is so powerful about what we're going through now is because we're all have been experiencing so much discomfort and being in so many different ways outside of our comfort zones and dealing with situations that we never have, that it feels like it's pushing us all to be able to experience things that we haven't in the past, you know, and should have been. And I completely agree in terms of the moral imperative. So I think this is a very unique moment where we can push ourselves a lot further, all of us, to make ourselves, you know, open to hearing very, very different things than we have done. And I think it's a very powerful moment, and there's so much change that can happen as a result. If someone is resistant to any kind of putting themselves in any kind of uncomfortable situation, how do you help them? Is it because you're helping align them first? That's where, you know, putting that comfort piece in to just make them a little bit more grounded together. Is that why you do it?
Yeah. I feel like you're speaking to something that's sort of a constant struggle in the work that I do, you know, because my work really is ultimately about leading difficult conversations. And there are times where I'll go into organizations and it's just like, they just haven't thought to have it. They need a little bit of structure. Then, you know, there's a reason that we created a 4-step process, because it just sort of like, it helps you have this difficult conversation. But essentially, the people there are all well-intentioned, well-dispositioned towards each other, kind of open to the process, and they're ready, you know, and they're ready to go. And then there are other times where you'll actually have some either inadvertent or conscious, you know, bad actors, you know, like people who are, who don't value empathy, or, you know, just simply don't have that value. They may even pretend to, but then they actually don't. Or people who just I don't know how to describe it. Like they're kind of defended, you know, like I was just talking to somebody in a different kind of business context, but we were talking about how you often see family dynamics recreated in the business world, you know, and sometimes like you'll see people like, oh, you have like this deep emotional wound. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I'm not going to go there with you, you know, kind of into it, but like there's this kind of wound, but it's causing you to kind of hurt people around you. You're railroading over the other people. And there've been times when, you know, I'm actually I can't name the organization, but I'm thinking of an organization I worked with a while ago that had a leader who I think is extremely well-intentioned, but also has that kind of, you know, reflexive background. And so he's creating this kind of chaos around him, but he's also created this organization, which is really powerful, really disruptive, and I believe really important for the world. Like, I think it needs to exist. So facilitating that conversation for me was one of just constantly trying to like push on, like, how deep can we go? How can we get, you know, like, what's the real problem here? And sometimes it's as simple as me just asking that question, what's the real issue here? And then being quiet and letting the real issue come out, and then letting the room get kind of hot and intense, and me being like, you guys got this. We can get through this.
Then you're the therapist, right? You're the business therapist.
I really try not to. I mean, I am so not a psychological perspective.
I know, but so much of this is about psychology, right? I mean, when we're dealing with people and people dealing with people, that's what it comes. I mean, that's one of the things that I find so fascinating about it. And when you kind of like when it gets down to the problem, and I'll just say a tiny anecdote here. I worked for a bit with Cesar Millan when I was actually working at IMG, and it was so interesting to see him when he was working with the dogs, because when there were issues with the dogs, it was actually the issue with the owner. And he had this amazing way about him that he was helping the owner psychologically stand up straight, be the pack leader. And it was so much about psychology, but it was essentially, directed towards the dog, but actually towards the owner. So it's it's a delicate crafting, for you crafting those conversations to be able to help someone change, sort of shift how they have the conversations, how they lead, and get to the bottom of that in a non-psychiatrist environment.
Yeah. I mean, in actually, you're funny. You're speaking my language. There's a wonderful film called Buck the Film, which is about a horse trainer who has a similar. He says people, people think I'm helping, people with horse problems, but really I'm helping horses with people problems. And I often think I'm hired to help, or I'm hired by leadership teams to help them with team or organization problems, but really I'm helping organizations with leadership problems. But also I find, I think in the situation I was just describing, what I found is that it didn't feel good to me to be in that situation. Like it was actually I found it very challenging. I can be kind of a sensitive person, and anybody who's known me for a while can attest to that. But that it was my job to kind of remain non-reactive and to sort of, in some ways sort of be that pack leader, like give them permission to say the thing that they hadn't said before. Sometimes anonymity helps. I'll say, everybody write on a card, what's the conversation that we need to have, but we're not having? And let's do it anonymously. Let's put it up on the wall and let's see if we can cluster anything. And all of a sudden you'll find out there's this one kind of root disagreement or root issue that everybody's been dancing around. People are saying, we need a new tool for this, but what they really mean is we need a new product strategy, because now we're in a services space and no longer in a product space, and we just haven't grappled with that yet. And we really need to grapple with that change, and we really need to understand what that means fundamentally for how our business operates. So kind of just figuring out what that most important conversation has. And then I think one more thing I'll just say real quickly is I always take the sort of progress, not perfection stance. As long as we are moving towards the right conversation and having it in a somewhat, in a way that doesn't destroy, because conversations can actually blow up. Or I've been I was on a leadership team of an organization years ago that we had one big meeting that resulted in the end of the company. It was because it exposed a fundamental disagreement between the person who held the technology patents and the person who held the money, the investment money for the organization. And, literally in one meeting, all of a sudden we were all out of a job. It was this kind of, we were a startup anyway. So we were all, just kind of getting going. But as long as we're not doing that, as long as we're moving, and actually in that case, that was the right conversation, because there was this fundamental disagreement. I was grateful that we had had it then, and we didn't have it 6 months from now after we'd all wasted all this time and didn't dance around it forever.
Yeah. Was that also a seminal moment that you kept going back to as you sort of have been developing all of this, and obviously in writing the book, thinking back to what happened at that particular during that meeting that could have gone differently, because as you said, in some ways it was both explosive but actually the right thing to happen. How will people know if something's going in the direction that it should, particularly if it means a disruption, for example, more disruption? For example, when people are sort of centering on or trying to sort of articulate their cultural values, some of the challenge with that is it can mean that some people then leave, because when you have a sort of broad, more vague culture, it can kind of fit everybody. But if you're really focused on culture, then there are some people who might say, and very much might say, this is not actually what suits me, and certain people going into that will know it. And so how do you deal with that type of looking at culture, understanding that sort of that fit, and when whether it's to push forward and to help people make that progress, which is a key word for me too, to make that progress, even if it is meaning initially more discomfort? Yeah,
it's such a good question, and I think we share the same, in many ways the same perspective on it. But yeah, it's a discovery process. I think my wife and I, when we originally published Radical Alignment, we published a much smaller version of it initially ourselves before we got a publisher. And the original title was Getting to Hell Yes. You know, the idea that we're all going to be a hell yes about something together. And as we were writing a book under that title, we were like, well, you know what? If you're going to get to a hell yes with somebody, you kind of have to be willing to get to a hell no with them as well, right? You have to be entertaining that as a possibility.
That's
if you
so
don't,
true.
Yeah, like if I'm trying to
I did love
force
the Hell Yes title. I have that. I have a
Good
copy
title.
of that earlier version too. But yes, you do have to deal with both yes and no. Yeah, that's
and sometimes that's the best case, right? Like figuring out early on. I worked with an Australian guy years ago. He always said, and he was a sales guy, and he always said, he says the point is to get to your no's faster, and he didn't mean your nose, he meant the no. Like if I'm in a sales, and there's something that's going to torpedo the sale, let me figure that out now. Let me figure that out today rather than 6 months from now, like after I put in a bunch of time. So he was all about like leaning in, getting to the objections quickly. And I have a feeling, I think that kind of informed, as well as that experience with that leadership team. By the way, I didn't tell you, like, I actually facilitated that meeting that I would say destroyed that company. And very,
Bob Gower, radical alignment. He destroys companies. No.
I know. Like it's terrible to, I think this is something that consultants, probably shouldn't talk about on the internet the way I am right now, but we do talk about privately. Yeah.
But it is very, very powerful. And also that recognition that, if you're not aligned to begin with, the same as marriages, if you're not aligned to begin with, it's going to be very, very hard to be aligned further on down the line. And so that having that understanding, and however the conversation goes, but having that understanding and getting to that conversation, getting to the no or the yes quickly, I think it's hugely important, as challenging as it may be.
Yeah.
What are some of the practical tips that people can take away today and implement today or tomorrow in terms of being able to have, if you could go through those sort of 4 steps and what that really means for somebody if they're going to be approaching a difficult conversation, whatever it might be about, a project, technology, somebody's got a personal issue, more towards the workplace would be helpful. But also, I mean, our working lives are so integrated now that so many people are working from home that there's whether it's personal or professional, I think it's very helpful. It would be great if you could just go through those steps.
Yeah, sure. So again, the steps are for some reason hard to remember, and we've been trying to reduce them or create a mnemonic for them, and it's that's why we wrote the book, frankly, because we were like, this is the simplest version we can get to this. But it's ICBD is maybe the acronym to remember. We call it the all-in method, but essentially you either journal for yourself or you talk with your partner. You can do it in a personal context, or you talk with the team. But everybody will share their intentions, and this can be. And usually we want to scope the intentions to something specific. So let's say I'm on a new team. Actually, I can talk about, we just launched a book. And so we're also, and my business partner of several years just took a job as CEO of a company. And so my wife and I we needed to kind of retool our business life a little bit. So, we sort of sit down and say, well, what are our intentions? Well, our intentions are we want to make an impact on the world, and we want to make some good money, and we want to learn and have some fun. Like, that's why we do what we do. Our concerns are that we may need to repackage what we're doing, so intentions. So let's just get clear on intentions. The next thing we're going to say is, what are your concerns? All right. So given that our mission is to, make money for our family, put a kid through college, and live our lifestyle or whatever, right? What are and have the impact we're trying to have on the world around this business? What are our concerns? Well, our concerns are, that we might need to take jobs we don't want to take. Our concerns are that deal flow is not going to be what it could be. Concerns are we're going to die alone under a bridge after stress and get divorced, like everything from like crazy to the real practical. And then we talk about, what are the boundaries? Well, the boundaries that seem to make sense for our business, we've moved away from doing long projects, where we're doing like big strategy work, to where we're doing much more sort of targeted, like facilitating a single strategy conversation with a team, or facilitating or doing a specific team. I'll maybe coach a team for a while, but I won't necessarily like create a deliverable for that team, because that was part of my old business and my old partner. It's not part of me now. So intentions, concerns, boundaries, And then we also have our personal boundaries, which I described already here, like because it's my wife and because this is our office and our home. And then finally, we find it's really useful to dream together, like, well, if this is the most impactful business it could be, what might be true, like who would be a really amazing reference client? Like who would be our dream client to be working for? Or who would be our, we could even talk about our dream, revenue, for the year, like how much revenue would we create for the year? Or, just sort of like, and that we find doing that a little more organically and a little more visually is really good. But intentions, concerns, boundaries, and dreams. Again, this can be a personal journaling practice. It can help you really get clear even before you have the conversation with somebody else.
Right.
And it can also be like we just recently facilitated it with, we had a 60-person technology sales team for a global technology company whose name you would know, and you maybe even use their product today.
Right.
And in an hour and a half, we made it anonymous, and we used a digital workboard called Fun Retro, where they could just write it all down really quick. Okay. Why are we on this team? What are we concerned about for the coming quarter? What are some personal boundaries that help me be my best and help us be our best? And if this goes exceptionally well, what is our dream state? And then all of a sudden we had this like really beautiful set of information from which
great. Yeah.
they could make changes to their team, and they felt more aligned, they felt more empathic, but they also had better information from which to restructure certain tool sets or certain ways the team operated.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's perfect. So intention, concerns, boundaries, dreams. Love it.
Yeah. ICBD.
Well, we've talked about a lot of different things. What haven't I asked you that I should have asked you, or that you would want to share anyway, or that's completely out of left field and some crazy story that happened yesterday that just needs sharing right now? It's all out there. What haven't I asked?
Well, I think the thing, I'm just going to do the very top of mind thing, which is always kind of comes back to like, what book am I reading now, or what thing am I really inspired by? And right now I'm reading a book. It's actually came out in the mid 90s, and it's by a neuroscientist by the name of Antonio Damasio, who I think teaches at UCLA.
Okay.
And he wrote a book, and the book is called Descartes' Error. And Descartes, of course, was I think, therefore I am, right? Like, right? Like the sort of the mind-body separation or the logic emotion separation. And he goes through, he tells these like fascinating stories in the book about like brain damage to the sort of the neocortex, and sort of like sort of how people had difficulty making decisions and why. Anyway, I won't give it all away because I can't, because he's speaking in Martian half the time. But the point of the book is that our emotions are intimately tied to our reason. In other words, you cannot reason effectively unless you are also unless you also have kind of are in connection with your emotions. So going back to our conversation earlier about like people feeling uncomfortable and then getting defended and then using their ego and their power to push those things away. Yeah. What I really want to encourage people to do is to actually bring their emotions closer and to welcome their emotions in the workplace. And I'm trying to remember the name of the book right now. Liz, I don't remember the last names. Liz and Molly wrote a wonderful book. I think it's just called Emotions at Work. Okay. She's with IDEO. I can give it to you. You can sort of share it. But,
yes, and I'll share it. Mm-hmm.
But like, I really think it's important that we acknowledge that we are emotional beings, and that, and it's so common, I think, in workplaces for people to be like, I'm not emotional, I'm just passionate. And that's sort of like that male thing to do. Meanwhile, he's really angry. He seems really angry at you, and it's really scary, and somebody else cries and they're like, you're just too emotional. And like, wait, no, that's just like the human response to someone yelling at me.
And also the, emotions are viewed as being weak or I think if we, when we can identify them and articulate them, it also allows us to deal with them and to be, more open and honest and connect better and be empathetic. I mean, that really is, it's about emotional connectivity. And I think it's so important. So what was the author of that? Antonio
Damasio.
Antonio Damasio.
Yeah, so he's a neuroscientist, and again, I think he teaches at UCLA. He's Italian, and he's written several other books, but this one is from the mid '90s, and it's
Okay.
It's really, really eye-opening. He tells some very gory stories about people getting brain damage and living through it, and then like how their personalities changed, and then why, and what that tells us about how our brains operate. He gets very much into like sort of how your brain is structured. It really, like you sit and read the book, and you suddenly think of your body in this whole new way. It's when I have this whole new experience of myself as I read the book. But I really think of like teamwork and life as like it's the emotional landscape, which is often overlooked and often the most important thing that's running the show.
So much so because, teamwork wasn't a thing, a few decades ago. We really didn't do that much work together in teams, or certainly not as much, and certainly not dealing with as complex environment and problems that as we need to deal with now. Bob, it's now an hour. We always have a great conversation, and I can always continue talking with you for so long, but I have to wrap up now. And I really, really appreciate your time and sharing everything that you have. I thank you very much for giving us the intention. Oh my goodness, intention, concern, boundaries, and dreams.
You got it.
Wonderful. So Bob's book, Bob Gower, and your wife's last name. Your wife's name is Alex, and her last name
Alexandra Jameson and Bob Gower. I always like to put her first. It's alphabetical.
And it's called Radical Alignment. And thank you so much, Bob. And I hope you've all had a good time listening. And I look forward to any questions you have after this. Please share on LinkedIn, and we'll respond. Take care. Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sophie.